The Thule Society was the Munich, Bavaria-based branch of a larger occult organization called the Germanenorden. The Thule Society is actually important for history because it formed an organization called the German Workers' Party, which quickly became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, aka the Nazi Party. They did this because they wanted a public platform for their more esoteric ideas. They realized that the worship of Odin and Thor and practice of ceremonial magic was not going to reach a large audience of people, but they had a political and economic agenda. And by forming a party around working class, lower middle class people, they hope to kind of insinuate their ideology to the wider public, and unfortunately, they succeeded in doing that.
So, did they come about based on previous organizations, or were they sort of a new concept?
They were not a new concept. They were part of a really vast and complicated network of occult organizations that grew up in the late 19th century. And to try to encapsulate this in some way, uh, some of these organizations were explicitly racist or anti-Semitic. Some of them were not. Many of them, we would say today, would fall on the right wing side of the political spectrum, but not all of them were. Um, the particular configuration of groups that the Thule Society came out of, they were based on a particular philosophy, if you want to call it that, ideology really, called Ariosophy, which is a combination of Aryan, aka Northern European, and Theosophy. Theosophy was a big thing in the 19th century. It was an effort by, I would say, educated people who had lost their faith in Western Christianity, but they didn't want to adopt a purely scientific, materialistic view of the world either. So they were searching for something else. They thought they found it in the hidden masters of northern India, secreted inside the Himalayan mountains. They had a whole mythology surrounding what they claimed to be doing.
Does that come
So,
from like Blavatsky stuff and the Secret Doctrine?
exactly, yeah. She was the founder of that. She claimed access to hidden ancient texts and contact with so-called hidden masters who were guiding her through all of this. So theosophy spread around the world, including into Europe. It reached German-speaking Europe, and there it collided with, particularly Vienna is really the kind of birthplace of this. There was an interesting guy in Vienna named Guido von List. Guido von List was a playwright, a novelist, a poet, a folklorist, a mountain climber, the kind of guy who would put on a pair of hiking boots and spend the weekend out in the forest. A larger than life figure. For some reason, Allen Ginsberg comes to mind when I think of somebody of more recent times, as a person who thought that if you change the cultural paradigm, you can change the world. And that's what he wanted to do. He was living in Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, circa 1880, 1890. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had some problems that may remind people in America of the United States today. It was a multi-ethnic empire with many minority groups, you know, asserting special rights, bristling at previous historical prejudice against them. And the dominant people, the German-speaking people of Austria, felt threatened by all of this. Uh, you could say it's make Austria great again. I mean, in a certain sense, they felt very threatened by the rise of Hungarians and Serbs and Bohemians and the Jews, of course, particularly too, all the various minority groups living in that empire. and they began to form a more radical kind of anti-Semitic doctrine because of all of the minority groups they felt threatened by. The Jews were the ones they were most worried about. And so, while adopting the basic ideas of theosophy, they combined it with the idea that the so-called Aryan race, which does not just mean Germans, by the way, it includes Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, English people, and even, by extension, they looked at groups further east. Some of the people of Iran and northern India might have been classified by them as Aryan also. They thought this was the race that should dominate the world, and they felt particularly threatened by the Jews. It would also be a mistake, I think, to think of the Ariosophists as believing the Jews were an inferior race. They were not like the white Christian nationalists of America today, or who tend to look down on Black and Hispanic people as being somehow inferior. I think that the proponents of Ariosophy were afraid that the Jews were superior to them. Okay. They saw this as a kind of a race war in the progress of happening. It was going to be one or the other. Either the Aryans would dominate the world or the Jews would, and they didn't want to be on the losing side of this imaginary conflict. And so they began spreading their ideas, establishing kindred organizations, again, gathered around not just plain anti-Semitism, but gathered around some kind of idea, a mythology of ancient Northern Europe, right. The old gods of Odin, Thor, and so on, as being the archetypes of the true nature of the Aryan race. And so this idea traveled to Munich in southern Germany and Bavaria, was picked up by a very interesting, eccentric fellow by the name of Rudolf von Stibatendorf, who formed a kind of a local lodge, a branch of all of this that he called the Thule Society.
Okay, and so what year was that society actually formed in?
During World War I, so about circa 1915.
Okay, and is this formed as sort of a reaction to the war going on?
No, not particularly. Groups of this kind had been around for many years before the war broke out. What really brought the Thule Society to the fore was the end of the war, the defeat of Germany. This was a real crushing blow to everyone in Germany, partly because they were being lied to by their government and by the German news media, who were telling people we're winning the war. It's a matter of time now. We've knocked Russia out of the war. The Americans aren't going to have too much of an impact once they land in France. The British and the French are wearing down. We are on the verge of victory, and all of a sudden, they lost. And there was an enormous economic problems that occurred, partly because of the war. And there was also a series of communist-inspired Bolshevik uprisings across the country. And so the Thule Society became prominent in Bavaria, the southernmost German state, in organizing paramilitary organizations that fought the left-wing forces of Bavaria, and were instrumental, in fact, in defeating them and establishing what was for a while the legitimate government of that state. But they do all this, they never had really more than 1,500 members at most, not including some of the paramilitary militia types who just wanted to fight, basically, who may not have had any idea of what the Thule Society really stood for, but they're against communism, so we will join up with them and fight in this civil war against the left wing in our part of Germany.
And you have like a generation of young men who just went through a war, who come out of it, and now they're given more opportunity to fight and not really reintegrate into society, right?
Exactly. If you can imagine the American veterans of the deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq times 100.
Right. And
I mean,
the warfare was
enormous.
significantly more violent. And I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan's violent, but it's nothing like trench warfare and gas warfare where
Hmm.
you have just millions of a generation dying.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't know if anybody has ever really come to grips with the extent of the psychological damage that must have occurred to most of the people or many of the people who survived all of this. It wasn't very good on the home front either because the deprivation was such that, as I recall, people were making coffee out of acorns and eating turnips as their major meal night after night because there was a shortage of food. Um, but to actually be under fire in the trenches for a period of years, I mean, of course, they rotated the troops. You weren't literally sitting in the front line trench for 4 years, but so you went off, took a leave for a couple of weeks. Maybe you were lucky enough to be transferred somewhere else, but you tended to be there a lot. You spent a lot of time in a very unpleasant, unhygienic situation, facing shell fire, facing poison gas, facing the possibility of near suicidal attacks from your enemies. So just you can just imagine that some people returned home wanting to continue
Right.
to fight for something, and your country was just devastated. And here you have Bolshevik communists who are trying to import something similar to what was developing in the Soviet Union. You are appalled by this particular ideology. You don't want to live in a communist state. You reject Marxism and whatever it may be. And so you are going to be very willing to take up arms and fight this battle. And of course, many of these same people, once these civil wars in Germany were over with, because the communists lost in all cases. So the conservatives or right wing won, but still, there were problems, and the veterans of World War I became material for the Nazis. Later on, the various stormtrooper organizations were formed out of combat veterans.
Right. And one of the things that I find interesting and I think is often forgotten is we're all aware to some extent of the depression going on in Germany after the First War. But like all the video footage, right, is from film. So you have people like Fritz Lang making movies, and it seems like there's an art explosion during this time. And that's kind of what gets remembered, but it was significantly worse than what we're imagining, right?
Right.
Right. So
Well, the
like,
old stories of, you take a wheelbarrow full of money to the baker in the morning, and that wheelbarrow of paper money buys you a loaf of bread. And in the afternoon, you would need two wheelbarrows of the same money to buy two loaves of bread.
right.
So, yeah.
And they don't put that in like the movie M necessarily. uh,
No, I mean it would be interesting to analyze films like and Metropolis and so on, because in the background of all of that, if you're aware of what things you're just talking about here, you would kind of sense that something must have gone wrong here in this
right.
society. There's some darkness here. There's a sense of anxiety and unease that I think permeated, the arts and culture of Weimar era Germany. Fascinating period of time. Great stuff was being made there, right alongside the growth of Nazism. And for many people in Germany, it came to be either you're with the right wing or the left wing. There's a famous photograph, I think during like the 1932 presidential election in that country, tenements in a tenement neighborhood in Berlin. On one side of the street, big swastika banners. On the other side of the street, hammer, sickle, and star banners. People were living closely packed together and had very different radical views of how to change a society that wasn't working for them. And that, of
Right.
course, were radical ideas such as some of the stuff that Thule Society had to offer can find an audience if most people or many people are just extremely unhappy with the direction of the place where they live.
And did the Thule Society have connections to things like the OTO and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn?
At least indirectly, they did. This would be something if somebody wants to do a sequel to my book. To find the paper trail connecting all this would be a fascinating thing. And one of there are a couple of problems in the way the Thule Society has been represented. One on the academic historical side, and the other in pop culture. When I wrote this book, it originated as my thesis in graduate school. This was 1991, and what I was doing with the Thule Society was completely out of academic fashion at that point.
Right.
For one thing, there was a kind of kindergarten Marxism that said that all of history is determined by, this is the term, vast social forces. So what individual people did doesn't matter much. It's just vast social forces. Okay, so you've got that. There was no interest in exploring the occult. There was the attitude that if you believe in a conspiracy theory, then you are an outlier. You are you remember the reaction to Oliver Stone's JFK assassination movie, universal condemnation of this. And so what I was saying in my thesis was that there was a conspiracy by a secretive group of people called the Thule Society that resulted in the Nazi Party. They were conspiring to change the world really in a very radical way. And I was lucky to find the necessary 3 professors to be on my thesis committee. And I got it approved with distinction at the time, but there was no academic publication for it really possible. And so it sat in my drawer for about 10, 12 years. I became re-inspired to look at it again, and I began to, in my spare time, expand the book, particularly looking at where the Thule Society sat in relation to other things going on in the culture of the West, and in Europe particularly, in the arts and in intellectual ideas at the time. And I expanded it into the book that it became as it was published in 2012. And so anyway, so the academic historians, of the recent past would often mention the Thule Society in one sentence, or there'd be a paragraph on it somewhere. And it was as if they were very uncomfortable with the idea of something this weird having such an enormous impact. So they would kind of get past it real quickly. Okay, yeah, we'll mention it now, on to the stuff that we think is really important, the economic situation and the parliamentary and constitutional problems of Germany and so on. So you have that on the one side. And then on the other side, in pop culture, you have an exaggeration often of the Thule Society. They have been called the controlling force behind Nazi Germany. That there was the leaders of the Thule Society were actually pulling the strings. Hitler was dancing to their tune pretty much. And all kinds of really bizarre things. There have been books out claiming the Thule Society was in contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, that the UFOs that began to be spotted after World War II were actually constructed by the Thule Society using alien technology. And there was even something that an alien interstellar invasion force was on its way to help Thule establish control of the Earth. I think they were due in about 1999 or something like that. And I
Oh,
guess,
they're due all the time if you listen to.
yeah, yeah, we're lucky they never got here. Um, so you have all kinds of colorful, fanciful things like that. Some of it, is purely fictional. I mean, the Hellboy stuff. I mean, Thule plays into that, but you have actual, people who claim to be writing history for a popular audience who are bringing outrageous claims to bear on Thule. And I think of myself when I write history as a responsible historian. It was what I was trained to do. And to be a responsible historian, I'm kind of circling back to your question a couple minutes ago. You need to be able to have factual information of some kind. It's kind of like being a police detective. You're sorting through the evidence. A crime or an event took place here. Okay, who was involved? What exactly happened? Um, was there a conspiracy behind it or other groups of people here? And so in writing Hammer of the Gods, I stuck very closely to what I could verify.
Right. I
And
often find, because I've been labeled a conspiracy theorist by a number of people, but my argument is always they're not theories if they're true. And, and basically, like, whenever something is presented to me as being, they did this, I'm like, okay, who is they?
right.
That's my first question. If you can't figure out who the they is, then it falls apart, right? And once you figure out who the they is, you're gonna be like, well, what would they gain from this? And the follow-up thing is, how would it even have been done? If you can answer who they is, what they would gain, and how they would have done it, I believe that a theory is worth looking into.
Okay.
Um, but
I
I
think I
also,
did that with Thule.
yeah, that's what it seems like.
Um,
But I also always find, looking, because this is part of a larger series that, believe it or not, deals with the 1960s in Los Angeles, but this is related.
mhm.
um, so, a lot of this stuff, there's theories that are clearly blown out of proportion, right? And then there's the baseline, like with the Manson stuff, helter skelter. And I'm like, I don't know that that's the exact truth, right?
Right.
um, Now, the opposite end of the spectrum probably isn't either. But like with the Thule Society, they're not nothing, but they're probably not in contact with aliens.
No, I
So,
don't believe that they're in contact with aliens. Speaking of conspiracies, it struck me recently that another book that I wrote called Secret Societies in American History was
right,
published, I think, in 2014, 15. I predicted something very much like QAnon. I said that there will be a apparently leaderless, entirely web-based cult group influencing many people through the internet. They would have no meetings, no formal organization, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that QAnon, or especially QAnon, was this idea, the satanic pedophile cult involving very important, wealthy, influential people. It seems to me that the recent publication of Jeffrey Epstein documents kind of verifies a big part of that.
I
I
mean, that's
mean,
the thing with
we
Alex
haven't seen
Jones.
any evidence of black masses being conducted on Epstein's island, but pretty much the rest of it seems to have happened because you have this network of highly important people who were aware of what was going on. They were covering each other's backs and all of this, and they were evidently, providing each other with information and assets to facilitate their various objectives in life. So that is a international conspiracy on the highest order,
And it goes
and
back a long time. Like, it's not a
goes
news
back a long
development.
time. Yeah, yeah. So if you're looking at the 1960s, kind of in Los Angeles, and Charles Manson believed in many of the things that the Thule Society was connected with, even kind of like, underground kingdom below the surface of the earth kind of stuff, as I recall, and the whole idea of a race war of some kind, which is what he wanted to do. Um, many of these kinds of ideas keep circulating and they keep popping up one place or another, under one name or another, in one circumstance or another. But in many ways, we're not at a point in history, if we ever will be, that where we've gotten past these things.
Right, and I mean, like back in the Manson stuff, after the trials happened, and him and some of the other important family members were in prison, a split happened where a number of them became very heavily, including Manson, associated with the Aryan Brotherhood,
Mhm.
right? And other ones were like, I don't want to do that, actually, that seems insane. Um, but the Aryan Brotherhood matched, the concept and the ideology of parts of Manson's plans and what he was preaching to people. And if you go further back in Los Angeles history in that whole tract, you end up looking at like Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard as part of
Oh
the
yeah,
OTO,
yeah.
right? And the OTO is connected to the Manson thing. There's a lodge out in the desert that believes the exact same things that Manson believed. um,
Hmm.
and you can jump, I believe, from Parsons and Hubbard back across, the water into Europe through Crowley,
Hmm.
and Crowley spying for, MI5 and being embedded in the OTO. And he was actually, we talked to a Professor Richard Spence, who wrote a book on Crowley. He was in Germany in 1931-32, and he was supposed to, I believe, track the rise of Hitler, and he was not particularly successful at it. Um, but they sent him there because he fit in perfectly in the society at the time, in theory, where the occult was becoming a thing of interest for many people.
Yeah, Crowley, I believe, worked for the Germans during World War One when he was living in the United States.
That was a lie. That
Um,
was a double agent, it turns out.
okay, well, he was a man of many faces
Oh, yes.
and much interest. And I guess the question I would ask if somebody um, asked me to do a sequel to Hammer of the Gods, the Crowley question would be of utmost in my mind. What connection did he have with them? Um, it seems to me that the whole story, okay, Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer who flew on his strange,
That's a fascinating
inexplicable,
story.
yeah, he flies to England, lands near the estate of a British aristocrat, offering to negotiate peace with this person who had no particular role in the British government at that time, as I understand it. My question there is was this British aristocrat, the Duke of Norwich, I think, something like I can't
I believe
remember
so.
right now. Yeah, well, was he part of an underground occult network that stretched across boundaries in such a way that Rudolf Hess might have thought that, I can talk to him about this, I can present this idea to him, and maybe he can have some impact.
Because why else would he have gone to him? He
Yeah,
wasn't.
why else would he have gone? I mean, it seems incredibly strange. Rudolf Hess, of course, was a member of the Thule Society, as were a couple of other prominent members of the Third Reich. Alfred Rosenberg, the official Nazi Party philosopher and later Minister of Conquered Eastern Territories, was in Thule, and Hans Frank, Hitler's personal attorney, who became Governor General of Poland during the war. And of course, Hitler himself was listed as a so-called guest member of Thule,
And what does
not a
that
full.
mean?
I think it meant he was still in the military for a year or so after World War One ended, and there were military regulations against active service members joining organizations. So being a
Okay.
guest member might have been some way around the rules. Uh, the thing about Hitler is kind of fascinating. What was his role? I mean, what did Thule do for him? What influence did Thule have on him?
Right, I can't
And
get a handle on Hitler's actual belief in like things like the occult. It seems less clear with him than with like Himmler, With Himmler, you're like, he seemed to be into it.
Oh,
With Hitler,
definitely.
you're like, was he using it?
He was impacted by it. I tend to think he was kind of a lapsed neo-pagan
Hmm.
in some way. In some of the private conversations that he had that were recorded, he was asked the question about reestablishing the old religion of Northern Europe. And he said, nah, that time has kind of gone. There are other things we need to do. Himmler, on the other hand, had commissioned a definite plan for reestablishing the old religion
Right.
after the war. It ended based upon seizing the properties of Christian churches to basically finance all of this.
And
And Himmler
there's
had
the
a
castle.
castle called
Yeah.
Wewelsburg, where uh, Himmler and many of his staff members seemed to be connected with a parallel organization to Thule. This is where it gets really complicated, disentangling all that. Himmler was not in Thule, but many of his people were in similar, and I would say worse organizations that had even a much more militant, if that's possible, agenda. For some reason, I tend to think about Rudolf von Sabbatendorf, the Grand Master and founder of Thule, as a person who may have regretted some of this
Hmm.
after a point in life, that he realized maybe this has been taken too far. Um, he seemed like a very cultivated world adventurer kind of person. Um, he was mentored in his early occultism by Jewish Kabbalists and people of that sort. And
Oh, that's
so
interesting.
he seemed to have no evidence of anti-Semitism until he returned to Germany after spending many years in the Middle East, in Turkey particularly. And so there may have been some kind of opportunism on his part in adopting Ariosophy, the Aryan kind of theosophy, because he thought that maybe there was a ready audience for this kind of thing among the circles of people that I want to hang around with. And he seemed to be a guy, not unlike Crowley at some points, who, kept an eye on his pocketbook and wanted to make some money off of his ideas, which,
Right. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the castle, and I'm going to butcher the name, so I'm not going to say it, but Himmler's
Wavelsburg.
Castle. Uh,
Wavelsburg, yes.
okay, because, that's a place that if you ever watch any of the History Channel type documentaries, uh, oftentimes they'll bring up the castle, and that's when they'll bring up, the school that they had there, which was probably true, but B, they'll bring up the aliens. The castle brings up the aliens like every time. So what was Himmler's actual goal with this piece of land?
He saw the SS, the higher ranks of the SS, as the beginnings of a, how can I put this, esoterically informed order of people,
Hmm.
like a monastic order in a certain sense,
Is it kind of like
that
the
would become,
Jesuits?
yes, the Jesuits wouldn't be a bad comparison. Highly motivated, well educated in their ideology, that would play the dominant role in the new order. And here we get into the complexities of Nazi Germany, because there were plenty of high-ranking Nazis who wanted nothing to do with anything like the occult or
Right.
Gabelsberg, Goering, and Goebbels, and Martin Bormann absolutely hated this stuff. Um, but Himmler was again part of a group of people who took the darkest possible view of the kinds of things that Ariosophy stood for. So Wewelsburg was going to be the Grand Lodge, the capital of this order, the Vatican of it, if you will.
Okay.
And their ceremonies took place there. There was a SS wedding ceremonies and different kinds of initiation rites that took place. Himmler was very keen on devising um, a kind of liturgical setting for the SS. And one of the really peculiar things, I think I made mention of it in Hammer of the Gods, um, 20, 30 years before Himmler and the SS, a British author named M.P. Shield wrote a short story about a group called the SS who were engaged in a campaign of mass murder across Europe in order to weed out inferior people.
That kind of thing happens quite a bit somehow.
Yeah,
You know, the Baron Trump books are another example of this is odd.
yeah. I mean, artists, I think, can really be a sort of seismograph that detects rumblings beneath the surface before the earthquake actually happens. So, yeah, SS, I mean, that has to do with runic symbols. I mean, they actually had a typewriter key with the SS runic symbol on, so you could just hit shift SS, and there it would be in the runic symbols.
Okay.
So they were very deep into runic lore. The SS had a subsidiary organization, the Ahnenerbe, which was their scholarly academic branch. They conducted, among other things, archaeological expeditions in the 1930s as far afield as Tibet and South America, looking for um, the ancient the scattering of the Aryan race across the world, because they claimed that it was the Aryans who did everything constructive. If you find a temple in the jungle of Cambodia, Angkor Wat or whatever, probably the Aryans were there to help build the thing. If it
Right.
was magnificent and important, we did that. And Thule, the word Thule, is kind of a mythical northernmost kingdom of the world, where some of these people believe that the Aryan race began there and then migrated, south and east and west and everywhere from there.
And there's a number of theories and conversations about the Nazis' search for things like the spear. I can't remember the name. The spear
Pure
that
destiny,
yes, thank you.
Longinus, yes, yes.
That, and then also oh my God, the Monty Python, Holy Grail. I had to say
Oh,
Monty
well,
Python.
Raiders of the Lost Ark, this was fiction, but it wasn't entirely off the mark
Well, isn't
because,
Otto Ron basically an Indiana Jones type character?
mhm, yeah, yeah.
That guy is
I mean, a lot of the pop culture fiction has some roots in reality, but you have to remember that it's also highly fictionalized. It's not entirely factual, but there's something there. So yeah, I mean, they really were interested in finding and gathering relics of power. I mean, Himmler even had a studied, I think it was the architecture of the spires of Oxford and Cambridge in England, because he thought that there was a cult significance to the way they were built, and that this is something that once the Germans conquered Britain, or became allied with Britain, whatever he thought would happen, if they made a peace treaty, that this would be something, again, kind of an energy center. All this, it sounds all very new agey in recent times, but lines of energy crisscrossing the earth, and if you could tap into that, um, all this kind of stuff. I mean, the organizations, the network of people, of groups that the Thule Society was part of, they espoused, vegetarianism often, and organic food. They were kind of anti-capitalist. They were in favor of small farming and a rural communal kind of thing, if possible,
Right.
getting in tune with the planetary forces. Animal rights. Well, one remarkable thing I came across, that Hitler was planning on banning horse racing after he won the war. He called it a vestige of feudalism.
Which is, I mean, all of those things are very like 1968 hippie kind of
Yeah,
concepts.
yeah, yeah. I mean, they put a different costume on them, and there you have it. What about the whole racial issue in America? Where was the average hippie on the question of blacks and Hispanics? And I think that we tend to think, well, they were, of course, very liberal people, but I'm not entirely certain of if that's true across the board.
Well, I mean, look at pictures of communes and how many like blacks and Hispanics are in the communes.
Yeah, no, and again, not unlike the net occult network I'm talking about here, there were variations. There were underground occult societies that were not anti-Semitic in the late 19th, early 20th century Europe, and there were others that were. So I'm sure that from one commune to another, you would find different perspectives and orientation. But yeah, I would say that many, of the people who went to Woodstock were very happy to, embrace like one person up there, Jimi Hendrix, because he was so cool. But they would
Right.
have, not wanted to go beyond that.
Right. They like Hendrix and Richie Havens, but and Santana.
Sure. And draw the line there. The rest of it, we don't want to go there. It's not our thing, and we think that what we're doing is better than what they're doing. And so, yeah, I mean, it's also the whole idea that rock music is somehow inherently of the left. And if you look at the beginnings of it, certainly Jerry Lee Lewis was certainly no leftist. Um, Elvis Presley, I think, was a decent-minded conservative, but not certainly no leftist. So no, I mean, the falsehoods multiply and disintegrate upon closer examination.
Well, there's a very interesting character in the Laurel Canyon scene in the 1960s, Robert Heinlein, who wrote Stranger in a Strange Land,
Hmm.
where he lives in Laurel Canyon, and he is the opposite of a leftist in every capacity.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Starship Troopers, yes, that
yeah,
guy.
and he is widely accepted and loved by members of the Mamas and the Papas and the Birds and just everyone there. He lives among them. And if you were looking at rock and roll in that time, it's viewed as being, anti-war, hippie, leftist, etc. But very few of those bands really made a lot of statements if you start breaking it down, right? Like the big Vietnam song is about the Sunset Strip riots. It's not about Vietnam,
Right.
and Jim Morrison, his dad is Gulf of Tonkin. Jim Morrison,
Admiral, yeah.
yeah, Jim Morrison's not speaking out against the war, um, but it became associated with the youth movement, and it's a very interesting. There's theories as to why that happened and certain agencies being involved. But it's interesting if you start looking at who the people are that are actually hanging out together, because the whole leftist rock and roll movement appears to not have existed.
I agree. If you look at anti-war songs of the 60s, you have Donovan from the UK did a couple of
Right, and like,
explicitly. Country Joe and the Fish was the American guy who did genuine
yeah,
anti-Vietnam
Feel
War
Like I'm
songs.
Fixing to Die is like an actual anti-war song. uh,
Yeah, I mean, he was a Navy veteran and probably disgruntled by his years of service or whatever it was. So he was there. But I mean, he was an outlier because for the most part, the 60s counterculture was focused on other things that coincided with the anti-war movement. And I'm imagining that, many people who joined in protests um, were, well, I mean, you go to Sunset Strip and dance on one night and go out the next day and protest was kind of the social milieu
right,
of a lot of areas. We can't discount the fact that after a certain point in the war, even if you had a college deferment, it was possible to lose it because they were beginning, the Johnson administration was becoming a little bit more desperate for manpower. So they began, I think you had to maintain a certain grade point level. If you fell below that, you might be subjected to the possibility of being called up. So there was certainly a kind of an anxiety over that can't be overlooked. But the war was largely fought by poor people, white, black, Hispanic, in this country who had no way out. I
right.
mean, their number came up, and where do you go? I mean, fleeing to Canada was not an option for most people at that level, even if it would have occurred to them to do that. So there you were, and um, thrown into a very difficult situation that many of the people protesting against the war did not have to face in the same way.
Well, there's also an interesting quote I think about from Abby Hoffman a lot, where first of all, the original anti-war movement was almost entirely taking place among like academics. You
Right.
know, if you're going to like when we have advisors in Vietnam, not technical people on the ground. Through like 65, 66, it's a lot of people in colleges, you know, and people like Abby Hoffman are hard to argue with because they're adults with like strong points. But then, you know, suddenly all these hippies show up and it discredits the whole movement. And because you can tell the general population that it's, hey, look, they're a bunch of kids who are really high and they're sleeping together and I don't know. But Abby Hoffman at one point was like, I don't know where all the hippies came from. You know, even he is like, this is a confusing movement for me because it's not us, but they're being lumped together with us. And it's that time period to me kind of it's a capsule of a lot of the different forces that were going through the modern history of man coming to a head.
Yes, well, it was made, the counterculture, the extent of it was made possible by what could may be looked at as the high water mark of American prosperity, where the middle class had grown so big and comfortable that the children of the middle class could afford to check out for a while.
Right.
They didn't have to go to the factory to work as their fathers may have, or go into some sort of a white collar sales job or whatever. There was suddenly this liberty and luxury of transitional time between teenage and adulthood. And you could go to college, you could do this and that, and kind of indulge yourself and experiment with things. I mean, I don't want to sound denigrating this, but I mean, um, a possibility for a massive counterculture on this scale, I don't think, I think it may have been historically unique because there have been countercultures of one kind or another going back centuries. And some of the people involved in the Thule Society would be countercultural in a certain sense, shared many of the same attributes, but there weren't millions of them because there couldn't have been, because the economies of earlier times did not allow that to take place. And so, yeah, all of a sudden, you're 18 years old in 1967, and it's all this cool stuff going on, and it looks fun. This does not necessarily mean any kind of definite political commitment of the sort that Abby Hoffman was looking for. You didn't suddenly, become ideologically committed to somehow changing the power structures of America, which is what Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman ultimately wanted to do. But you were having fun. You were all this great music and these new, drugs to try.
It was
And
fun. It seems fun. That's why we still talk about it, you know?
well, yeah, and I guess I have mixed feelings about all of that. I was not, by the way, I was born in 1960, so I was a child in the 60s, not of the 60s.
Right.
I was kind of a precocious child, so I was aware of some of the things going on. I was reading adult stuff at a young age and watching the TV news at the time, much better than the TV news of nowadays. And
It maybe was news.
yeah, it was. There was a lot of news to go on around in those days. Yeah, I look back on it and go, boy, that was really dumb and harmful. And yet this other kind of thing here is, yeah, that opened doors to rethinking about the environment. I think one of the positive things was of the whole Earth Day thing, that the realization that we can't simply use up all of our resources and endlessly pollute the environment and expect there to be no negative outcome from
Lake
that.
can't just like be on fire anymore, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I guess like a lot of currents of history, it brings along the good and the bad. And some people, I guess here's my complaint about a lot of members of that generation, that they tend to very much romanticize the era
Mhm.
to a great extent, even if they had little or no part in the fun stuff.
Right,
This is the thing, like the Woodstock, I think only like 200,000 people could go out there, but there are probably 2 million people who claim to have been there.
right. And I mean,
It was just,
because I'm 29, um, and I, it's interesting right now because I think we've reverted back to a place where young people are no longer afforded the opportunity to be in that weird stage that they were in the 60s of experiencing time to be in a counterculture and explore, because we're back to the point we don't have to go to factories anymore, but the cost of living has gotten so expensive, where 50% of income goes to rent, for example. I just saw an article that $3,000 is the average rent for an apartment in the
hmm,
country right now.
yeah.
That's insane. Health
Hmm.
insurance has doubled. Um, so, like, again, we're back at a point where, something like the Epstein files can come out, but people are so occupied with trying to live that we're like, what are we going to do about it?
Well, yeah, we have kind of gone back to the era of it's not an industrial proletariat in Karl Marx's words any longer, but it's kind of the DoorDash proletariat. I mean, especially with AI going on right now. I was listening to a Nobel Prize winner in economics talking about the theory of AI. So the companies, corporations downsize, reduce the cost of the goods produced, making consumption more affordable. But he was no dummy. He pointed out the flaws in all of this is that there is no ready solution to how to employ the people who are no longer working for companies that are
Right.
downsizing. And again, so you have, well, you're delivering pizzas for a lifetime. Um, maybe factory work was actually better than being a DoorDash driver in some ways. I
At
don't
least
know.
you had like benefits, you might be in a union, there might be benefits. With DoorDash, you don't even have a person you can call when like
Right.
something goes wrong.
Yeah. So you're on your own, and this sense of isolation and in alien, being kind of an alien in your own society, an atomized society, is giving rise to Great Depression, anxiety, um, self-harm, in many cases, I think outbursts of bizarre criminality, like the young person who went with a canister of gasoline and a hunting rifle over to Mar-a-Lago last week.
Right.
What does he think he's going to accomplish by doing that? But the mass shootings, I mean, maybe a better example of what I'm talking about. What would push people to the point of doing that? Maybe in some cases, hatred of targeted groups, but often I think they've just gone berserk because they have nothing to look forward to, no faith to hold on to,
Right.
nothing that gives meaning to their life.
And I think
And
that in the 60s, between 1960 and 1985, the serial killer became a thing. That had not,
right.
I mean, it had been a thing, but not to the just insane extent that it became one,
Mhm.
especially in California, where you have at certain points like 50 active serial killers, which is a
Yeah.
nuts number. Where I think we're looking at a time now where there's similar forces coming together. However, it is much, much harder to be a serial killer now because of all the forensics and the cameras.
Right.
So the medium of death has changed to the spree killing because you can get away with it once, but you can't get away with it, 20 times. But I think a lot of the same anxieties and depression kind of concepts that make people go insane are still there or have come back.
I think they're more prevalent. I think that the lone serial killers, who of course are different than the spree killers, because the serial killers thought they were going to get away with it indefinitely. I
Right.
would suppose.
And the spree
Uh,
killers do not.
yeah, you know you're on a suicide run here by doing that. Um, I again having lived. I mean, I'm alive now. I was alive then, and comparing and contrasting, the attitudes of people, in the 70s and 80s when I was coming of age, most people had hopes for a career. They had hopes for a comfortable way of life. They had hopes that things were working out, that the arc of history, as Martin Luther King said, bends toward progress and all of this. And I don't think that as very many people believe this any longer. And this is a major problem.
I mean, there's a saying that I don't know like where it came from, but essentially the concept is, for someone to be happy, they need something to do, someone to love, and something to look forward to.
Yeah.
And if you remove one of those things, it rings true. Like happiness becomes much harder to come by, right? And the something to look forward to has become much harder, I think, for a lot of people to see in this time.
Yeah, I talk to young people fairly often. I mean, and in my workplace, I'm the oldest person there, basically. I have other, community things that involve younger people, and they are all very, very worried. They don't think that they're going to be able to own a house. And when I was their age, I imagined that I would own a house, and I ended up having a condo. So yeah, I mean, my dream came true for that. It seems difficult to achieve the kinds of things that people that came of age at the time that I did were counting on,
Right. I mean,
because
it was the deal of the American dream, and
Mhm.
now if you hold up your end, you don't get the return anymore.
Yeah, at some point, I blame corporate leaders and people in politics and league with them for a lot of these problems, basically outsourcing much of the work in this country to cheaper labor pools around the world, um, forcing, turning colleges into an industry because of the assumption that if you don't have a college degree, you're going to get nowhere, so you have to go to college. And to do that, the cost of tuition,
Right.
when I went to college, it was pretty cheap. The costs have skyrocketed, and the only way, unless you're from a very affluent family, you have to go into debt to do this.
And you sign
And
that debt at 18 years old, and it can be, $200,000. And now you're
yes,
starting off $200,000 in debt.
yeah, and you can't declare bankruptcy on the basis
Nope.
of student loan debt, so you are stuck with this as a kind of indentured servant to. And it's even, I mean, if you were an indentured servant 300 years ago, you knew who your master was. You worked with him, underneath him, whatever.
And when you
You're an
get out,
indentured servant to an invisible system.
right.
It's an abstract system, which I think is even more anxiety inducing. If you know the person who's holding the whip over your head, I mean, you can kind of focus on that. But who do you blame, if you have $200,000 in debt at the age of 22 years old?
And the money doesn't
There's
even
no person.
exist.
Yeah.
Like, that's the other thing. All the debt that people are dealing with, and it's a similar thing to, Weimar Republic Germany, not to the same extent, but where like their money almost didn't exist because of how much you had to have of it to buy small amounts of items. Our money doesn't exist because it just doesn't exist. It's just written down somewhere that you have this,
Yeah.
but then if you go and try and get it, you can't, you know? Or if everyone were to pull all their money out of banks, it wouldn't be possible because that money
Mhm.
doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's become an abstract concept. I mean, I think we were better off in a day where you had to like pull money out of your pocket to buy things. I mean, the growth of credit, and I mean the credit card debt. Most people, many people are. It's another form of indentured servitude. You're working to pay off this abstract debt that you can't hold on to it and see it, but there it is, and it comes every month, and you're notified, and then you have. So no, I think we're in, kind of a bad dead end right now, a cul-de-sac maybe of a society, and I don't have any ability to predict what the next step will be or how we can get out of it. But I can say, maybe tying it back to Hammer of the Gods, that in situations of hopelessness, people tend to latch on to ideas that would otherwise be rejected.
Right. This is where I wanted to go, and you just took it there anyway. Was basically, because history, I don't believe history repeats itself, but I think patterns do.
It
Um,
rhymes.
right. It
Yeah.
doesn't, the same thing will never happen again, but you can definitely look back and see similarities and make assumptions. Um, so comparing this to, that very odd time period in Germany, and even with the QAnon stuff, where where do you see sort of underground movements going, or have the underground movements become the overground movements?
Well, the underground movements of the past became the overground movements. They were commodified, and getting back to the 60s counterculture, it became a whole set of industries catering to the consumption of people who wanted to identify with this in one way or another. So it became commodified. Jerry Rubin became a stockbroker.
Yeah,
Uh, well, Abby Hoffman, he stood to, to his
he held on
guns.
to it.
Yeah, yeah, he was on the run for a long time. Um,
Tim Leary turned into a Fed.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The underground movements of now. You know, political, violence. Let's just go start there for some reason. Un, Unlike the past, where you would have tightly organized groups like the Weather Underground in America, or the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland, groups of that kind, where it was almost a military kind of a structure. You had units, and you had a disciplined objective. Right now, you have, freelancers, individual people who are really mad about something, and they're not acting under any orders. They're being inspired by stuff that they find online, in some ways by online networks that are not
Sometimes those
really
online networks are also infiltrated by certain government agencies.
well. And yeah, there's nothing that anybody says or does online or on their phone or anywhere these days that can't be accessed. Everything that you and I are saying to each other right now, if somebody is interested in either one of us, they have it. I mean, even if
But
you
we are going
encrypt.
to put this out. It'll be
Yeah,
easy to find.
right. But there's no such thing as internet security. Everything, encryption, can keep out the amateurs, but the government, the NSA can read anything that they want to. And so, okay, so where do you go in a situation like that? If you were going to form a radical political organization, you would have to do it completely offline, face-to-face contact, messages by courier, hand delivered. But even then, I mean, so many of the militant organizations of the 60s were thoroughly infiltrated by the FBI at that time.
Oh yeah,
So,
I mean, COINTELPRO is
yeah,
an important operation that I don't think is brought up enough. I mean,
yeah.
they
Yeah, no, they infiltrated everything that they could possibly infiltrate. The joke after a while, if you have 10 radicals in the room, four of them are informers, probably, informing on each other too, probably too. So, yeah, I don't know. It seems like the impossibility of conducting anything political like that, cultural underground. I'm not sure what that would be right now either, because everybody is trying to commodify things. If a entrepreneur would notice some new thing, I don't even know what that would be right now. but a new thing in music, a new thing in fashion or lifestyle, even if you can imagine what that could possibly mean, there would be a marketing strategy around it in a very short period of time, and you would find it, on at Amazon if you like this, and then you'll like this new underground
Right.
phenomenon. So I don't know. I mean, I kind of despair of recreating the world that once existed because of the intertwining of everything, the ability to commodify everything, the ability to monitor everything. I find it spooky that, I buy a book and then I'm told, well, you also like these books. Okay, so every book that I buy online, every CD, everything that I look at is being looked at. And is it, purely for the commercial gain of giant companies? But this information is out there and can be used for many different kinds of ways. So I don't know, to answer your question, how an equivalent kind of an underground movement, a genuine underground movement of any kind, could take hold in today's world.
Well, something that I find, because we started as an apparel company, and obviously we do more than that now.
Hmm.
Um, but so a lot of our base in how people became interested in us is by either going back and posting things that were created 50 plus years ago, um, or creating new things that look like they were 50 plus years ago,
Right.
right? Because, the people, I believe, crave some form of realism, regardless of if it was real then or not. It could have been entirely concocted by an A&R department, but somehow it was people concocting it still. That A&R department was
Well,
still
yes.
human beings making decisions, and it wasn't based on how many Instagram followers you had. So, I find, again, like in fashion, in 2018, 19 through 2022, everyone was real into cowboy stuff. That got really big, and historically, after cowboys comes bikers. It happened in the 50s, it happened in the 70s, it happened in the like 90s, early 2000s, and it happened again. Um, we're at a point where music sounds exactly the same as it sounded in a lot of ways. Like a rock and roll band, we figured it out in 1962. It's,
Hmm.
two guitars, a bass, and drums. It's still a rock and roll band. We don't got anywhere to go with that. So,
There's nowhere to go with anything really. I have this conversation a lot because my career, began really as a music writer. I started a punk zine coming out of high school in the late 70s,
okay.
and my career went from there. So, um, how many ways are there to write a new rock and roll song? And I make this analogy. It's like impressionist landscape painting in the 19th century. This was a breakthrough, a new way of seeing the world, a new way of painting, a new way of visualizing. And okay, what do you do now? I mean, people are still painting that way. You can still put your easel outside somewhere and paint this in that style, but it's not going to be in any way new or revolutionary. It's like it can be a good piece of work, and it's like that with rock music, and it's gotten to be like that with hip hop. It certainly is like that with jazz, which I think is an exhausted art form. What people are still playing in blues bands, but there's nothing new you can do with it anymore. And am I okay with that? I mean, yeah, if I want to be a musician, and I'm happy and finding fulfillment in playing music. It might be an original song I wrote, but it's going to have the DNA of everything that has happened before it.
Right.
And I can think of no way of jump starting something new out of it because maybe there isn't anything. And with
Well,
fashion, I don't know what kind of new clothing could men or women wear that hasn't been done before.
well, I
I don't
mean,
know.
with because when I was in high school, and then into college, there was a big, like indie punk movement, right? Garage
Mhm.
rock, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And if you listen to like Mercy Mercy by the Rolling Stones, you're like, oh, they're just doing that. So I should just listen to the Stones doing it not some people copying that, you know?
Well,
um,
that has been my idea, is that the original source of things tends to be more vibrant, more interesting, and more alive in some way. So if I want to listen to blues, I'll go back to Chicago, South Side in the 1950s, Muddy Waters. I'll go
right.
back further than to Robert Johnson, to the Mississippi Delta. I'm not really, personally interested in, a blues band from the Midwest in 2026. And they might be really good at what they do. It's no insult to them. They may be good players. They've written songs that sort of reflect this genre, but I'm not going to get anything new and revealing, and there are no epiphanies to be had here from this stuff. But I think that is really a problem in the culture as a whole. I mean, what can we do except to replicate at this point everything that's been done better probably in the past?
To me, the only currently consistently interesting genre of music is what has been labeled under Americana,
Hmm.
um, because what that has done, it is relatively new in that the genres that it pulls from are not new, but the combinations of what they're doing with them is, right? So like there's a guy named Charlie Crockett, if you've ever listened to him, where you're like, okay, so you have a Tejano guitar player, a New Orleans jazz like trumpeter kind of thing, you know, and it's just all these different American styles of music put together in a way that they had not been before,
Hmm.
you know. So that genre still I can be like, oh, that's interesting. You're combining things I had not thought to combine. But once that happened, you know, after that point, you're like, okay, well, we've done that. So 20 years from now, we can't combine, you know, Dixieland jazz and Waylon Jennings because it's been done. You
Yeah,
know?
we're in an eclectic period right now. And people are far more willing than 40 years ago to combine different things together like that. And yeah, the result of that could be interesting music or interesting whatever else we might be talking about. But yes, even there's a point beyond which there's nothing new to combine. And if you look in the past, I mean, people have been combining things in surprising ways for a long time now. Jimmy Rogers, the country singer, had jazz musicians with him in the early 30s on a couple of
Right.
recordings. I mean, so it's not an entirely new thought, but yeah, I think that Americana is a good example of the eclecticism, the willingness to mix and match and blend things together and see what results can come from that.
And that's the other thing that I find with our time period now versus, you know, when you were growing up is I imagine you couldn't have cared less about anything that happened in like the 1920s music wise. You know, when you're in 1975, you're not going to be like, let me listen to a 20s recording. It's awesome. But now, you know, I can go on YouTube and watch an entire Marshall Tucker show, you
Hmm.
know, and it's in color and they're right there and it sounds good. Uh, and it's the same thing with movies. If you watch a restored version of Taxi Driver, it looks like it was shot yesterday.
Hmm.
You know, so but the movies made yesterday aren't as good. So like, what do you do with that?
What you do with that? Well, I'll tell you that in the case of people who came of age in my era, um, I guess if you had a historical perspective, for whatever reason, that some people have that and some people don't, matter of family upbringing, maybe, that I always kind of wanted to know where things came from. And so wanting to know where the music of my era, late 70s, came from, I kind of went back and began discovering things like, oh, old blues, old country, or whatever. But and if you were interested in movies, you would try to, trace back the history of it. It was harder work in those days.
It's much harder.
You couldn't just, there was no YouTube, there was no internet. You had to scrounge around if you wanted to listen to even older rock music. You would be scrounging around resale stores, the Goodwill, and the, you know, uh, it was almost like archaeology, digging through the rubble of the recent past to find some gem. Doing that, I think, was a very valuable exercise for those people like myself who wanted to do that because it was almost the difficulty of it made it kind of a hands-on experience in a way that simply, you know, clicking a few keys on your laptop and there you have, uh, Muddy Waters or Chuck Berry or Miles Davis or whoever you're looking for. Um, yeah, I think that the availability of the past today lends itself to eclecticism, and maybe the availability of the past is one of the reasons why we simply can't get beyond it.
I mean, I think
Living
that's
it now.
relatively true, because my dad is around your age, and growing up, I'd always kind of like romanticize like the 1970s, right? And he
Hmm.
would always be like, it wasn't that good, man."
Yep.
Like there was a depression, there was gas
Yep.
shortages, like
Hmm.
you own the only things that you're thinking about was the best. He was like, "There's a lot of bad music. It just doesn't get played anymore.
Yeah.
Only the best stuff from then gets played now. You forget all the crap that came out." Uh, so
There was
like,
a lot of bad music, which is why punk rock kind of had to happen. It was sort of a blow in the face of the boredom that rock music even had turned into by at that time. The highly formatted
right,
FM radio station that played the same 12 songs over and over and over again. And so punk rock in its origins here in America at least was a cultural rebellion, not a political one like it was in the UK, but it was people who were tired of being fed the same vanilla pudding over and over again and wanted something spicier.
like at a certain point, you get tired of REO Speedwagon, and you
Hmm.
kind of want to hear Minor Threat. You know,
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what happened. And now, again, I don't know what the equivalent kind of thing would be today because you can sample it at all. Minor Threat, REO Speedwagon, it's all sort of there. You can find it. You can. Um, so I don't know. I don't
Well,
know what
it's
the.
the interesting thing for me. I grew up in DC, and obviously that's a very big punk city in the
Right.
history of that genre.
Mm.
And when I was in high school, it was like the third wave of DC punk, where the originals Minor Threat, Iron Cross, etc. And then you have, bands like Q and Not You and Black Eyes on Discord doing post punk in the early 2000s, late 90s. And when I was in high school, it was a third wave of it. And it was still good. It was still fun. It was the worst one. No offense. I was in bands. I
Mm.
can talk. It was the worst one. No one remembers any of us, but it was still the same venues, the same older people were around. And now if I go back to DC, everything's gone. There's not going to be a fourth one. There's no place to play it.
Hmm.
You know. And it's interesting watching everything move online. Um,
Which is not as good of a thing. I don't think that you could have a genuine scene.
you
I
can't.
mean, what I was part of was a genuine scene. There were a couple hundred people here in Milwaukee who were into it. You got to know everybody. You shared, you know, records and musical ideas and cultural ideas, and you were dealing with everything face to face, and you're right up front with the people who were making the music. And if this migrates entirely online, it's going to be a really detached, uh, uninvolving, unengaging kind of experience in contrast to what had happened in the past.
Culture becomes very homogenized online. Every 3 months there's a new TV show that everyone in the world is watching.
Yeah.
It's like, well, and it's all you can see, or there's just people start talking the same, dressing the same. Like my dad would talk about when he grew up in Denver, how there'd be 2 years between the fashion in LA catching up, or Denver catching up with what was going on in LA or New York, fashion wise. You
Yeah.
know,
Well, the time gap, I mean, Milwaukee, as far as punk rock goes, I mean, punk rock began 1976, New York and London. 1978 was the year where it really happened here. So it was a 2 year music
right.
gap.
It's a 2 year
And
gap because you don't have Instagram to open up and be like, oh, that's what's going on in New York. Uh,
Yeah, but and I think there was the benefit of it was that the bands in Milwaukee, and I'm sure this is true elsewhere at the time. And I kind of know it because I was familiar, tried to listen to a lot of music from elsewhere. Um, you had time to kind of make it your own if you had any kind of creativity worth the name.
right, each city has a sound. LA punk, DC punk, and New York punk are different genres of punk.
Yeah, they were localized. There was some time to absorb what you were hearing about by rumor, and it didn't all happen simultaneously and at once. And one of the problems that I had with so-called alternative music after a point was it was becoming very homogenized. There wasn't as much of a sense of locality any longer. Um,
Or
so
like even with grunge, if you listen to it, it's pretty abundantly clear it came from the Pacific Northwest.
it sounds rainy and cloudy and dreary.
Right,
It really does.
it sounds like a bummer.
Hmm.
But again,
Yeah.
that got big because people were tired of hair metal, that broke,
Hmm.
and then everyone went, "Oh, that's like actually what sounds like people making music."
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, I don't know. It's always I like to talk to historians because I try and follow threads, and for me, one of my favorite things about the podcast is that I can talk to people that I find interesting. Um, it's just a benefit, and then people will listen to it. That's even cooler, you know. Um, so I appreciate you doing this very much.
Well, thank you. It forced me to reread my book, Hammer of the Gods, for the first time in about 10 years or so. So I still think it holds up.
Good. And then, we got on the a variety of things that I didn't even expect to go to, but that's why I like long form interviews.
Yeah, you can't beat them, and that is one of the good things about contemporary technology. I guess in the past, if you could have imagined an hour and a half long interview on a radio program, the National Public Radio, I don't even think there were long form radio interviews like this
Well, to
ever
me,
happening. So a podcast makes it possible.
one of my biggest influences is Dick Cavett, uh,
Hmm.
because he would just be like, "Here's Orson Welles for an hour
Yeah.
and nothing else," you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that would be the equivalent, that kind of talk
Yeah.
show.
And you can turn on the TV and just be like, you can learn something. It's interesting. And now you turn on a late night show and that's a whole nother thing.
Mhm.
But thank you again for doing this. I
Well,
appreciate
thank
it
you.
very much.
When will it be posted?
It'll be like Sunday. It'll be
Okay,
real soon. Yeah, I'll send it to you.
great.
And yeah, thank you again. This has been fun.
All right, good. Take care.
Thank you too. Bye.
Bye.
'Cause I'm lonely, wanna die. Yes, I'm lonely, wanna die. If I ain't dead already, girl, you know the reason why. In the morning, wanna die. In the evening, wanna die. If I ain't dead already, girl, you know the reason why. My mother was of the sky, my father was of the earth, but I am of the universe, and you know what it's worth. I'm lonely, wanna die. If I ain't dead already, girl, you know the reason why. The eagle picks my eye, the worm he licks my bone. Feels so suicidal, just like Dylan's Mr. Jones. I'm lonely, wanna die. If I ain't dead already. Well, you know the reason why. Black cloud crossed my mind, blue mist round my soul. Feel so suicidal, even hate my rock and roll.